Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me fine. It sounds like I'm coming through loud and clear. And so thank you for having me here today. I wanted to give this presentation. As Ahmed mentioned, I've been most recently a product manager for APIs. So this talk is very kind of more geared towards the idea of maybe you're in the space of building developer products, but even if you're not, maybe put the perspective on of when you build tools for internal people, I think you can carry over a lot of these same concepts. So this talk is really about applying user personas to build better developer platforms. And so I kind of have a question for you is like, how do you know that you're actually building the right thing? I think that's a really tough question, especially if you're in the developer space where maybe you have a product, maybe you want to build a product. And then you have all these users and customers who are like, I want this feature. And someone else, yes, me too. And then someone else is like, no, I don't want that feature. I want this other thing. And then the CEO comes flying in and is like, hey, you know our competitor has this really cool feature. I think we should add this too. And so you have like this influx of requests coming in from all different places. And so then obviously step one is you take all this feedback, and then you cram it into your Jira backlog. And then somehow you work through that Jira backlog. Maybe it takes you a decade to get through all of it, and more things keep on getting added to it. And then eventually you have a great product and you profit. So my talk is done here, so I'm just gonna get out of here. But obviously it's more complex than that. Like when you think about how do things even get into a backlog, there's a lot of questions to ask, like, how important is this feature? Like, when do I prioritize it? Do I work on it now, or do I work on it later? And then even what is success when I think about a feature that is going to be built into a product? And so welcome to the role of product management. I'm Chen. I'm a former full-time developer. Do not ask me to write code nowadays. I do occasionally just to keep some practice, but people are way better developers than me, so I won't be showing any code. I won't be doing any cool demos, so take it easy on me. But I was a full-time developer, so I do have a lot of empathy for kind of the struggles that you might have in your day-to-day. I'm really passionate about developer experience, and I worked in developer relations for maybe about 5 years. I did a lot of teaching, workshops, and I worked in the developer relations team of Google Chrome, where I was working on kind of evangelizing HTML5. And then I also did some hardware hackathons for Intel, because they had a hardware platform that they were kind of trying to get developers interested in building on. So I got a lot of experience with technical writing, going to hackathons, talking at events. I'm just really interested in making the developer experience like really exciting and accessible for people. But about 5 years ago, I moved into product management, where because of my specialty as being a developer and then also working in developer relations, I then started specializing in APIs and developer platforms. So formerly, I was at Ecobee, a Toronto company here that does hardware, most notably smart thermostats. Shout out to my coworkers over there. And then I was also at FreshBooks for a few years, where you may or may not know that they do actually have an API platform. And then currently I'm at a company called Receptivity. Shout out to my other coworkers who also showed up to support me over here, where they are originally an API company where you can take any bit of text and put it through a backend, and it will analyze it and actually give you psychological insights just from the text itself. So it's very cool technology, and they have an API that exposes that. So super excited to have this like really great experience in the industry. And so when I think about a product manager, I know you might have some expectations of people that you worked with that had the product manager role, but I kind of think of myself as a full-time decision maker, or at least this annoying person who asks a lot of questions in order to get other people to make decisions. And so I kind of go around and ask, what should we build? Like why should this feature exist? I might work with the engineering team to say, can we actually build this? Like, how do we build this? Can we actually build it in time? I ask questions like, who is going to use this feature? And then, is there actually enough people who will buy this feature? Because it's one thing to have people use it. It's another thing to actually be able to build a company and monetize a feature. And then ultimately, all these questions get put together into like, ultimately, should we build this feature? So there's a lot of information about product management. It's an entire craft. So I'm going to focus just on this who, and really focus on who with the lens of building tools for developers or developer platforms. And so you might say, I'm a developer, right? I'm a developer. So I already know what developers want, right? I just go take my personal experience, I put it into the Jira backlog, and then magically we have a product that everyone's going to use. But obviously I'm here to say, wait, not so fast. You might want to think a little bit harder about who your users are. And so the core thing with any kind of product, even if it's developer-facing or not, is that you are not the only user of your product, even if you are a developer. And then within the scope of developers, they're not all the same. Like some people have different technical experience, some people prefer different programming languages, some people have different specializations, and so they're not the exact same as you. So like you are not always your user. And then I'm going to go into some details about how sometimes the users of a dev tool are actually different than the people who buy your tool. So I'm going to go into that a little bit. But if we just think about users, I found it really important because earlier in my career, I did have that lens of, hey, I'm a developer, so if I think it satisfies my needs, it's going to satisfy everyone, but that's not true. And so there are a couple of frameworks in both business and product management called segmentation. And then in UX research, there's something called user personas, where this idea of segmenting your user base and creating user personas, it gives you a direction on what to build and when. And it gives you that direction because you have a clear idea of who you're building for and even what their outcomes are going to be. So like, how are you going to change their lives? So I'm going to give you like kind of an example where, let's say you have some people who have been requesting, sorry, actually maybe they're not even requesting, like you have a group of people in your customer base. If you kind of think about profiling them, they're full stack developers, so they do back end and front end development. And so when you kind of think about their needs, because they're doing both back end and front end, they would actually prefer to just understand your REST API and not try to learn a bunch of tools. Like they just want to learn something once, which is the REST API, and then move on. But then you maybe have some other people who are, let's say they're iOS developers. That's the only language that they work in. So they would much rather have a Swift SDK because they want to get to market quicker, and that's the only app that they build. And you can kind of see that these are two very different needs that are conflicting with each other, or maybe not even conflicting, but they're competing with each other. And if you have a small team, you're not going to be able to build all of these features at once. So it's good to be able to segment these users or your customers into these groups so you have a better idea of like, hey, as a group, what are some of the features that they're asking for, or what are some features that we could build that could satisfy their needs? And when you go even further than that, some people who request features can be quite loud. And so when you kind of look at your data, you might realize that, hey, the people who want to use REST APIs only, they either don't speak up or they're just a quieter group where the iOS developers are very loud and they spam your user request forms of like, when's this SDK coming out? But when you actually look at the data, you might actually see a different pattern. So it's really important to like be pragmatic about how you think about your user segmentation. And so when I think about improving your developer experience, I think it's really important to imagine customers who aren't you. And that would probably be the key takeaway, that you're trying to externalize who is your customer or who is your user. And so if you've never worked with personas before, and I think you probably already have, you may have not created any, but you've probably been exposed to a persona where it's an archetype. It's like a prototypical representation of a user. And the key thing about building these is that it summarizes a customer, it gives kind of a profile to them, but it also means it makes it very accessible for everyone in your team to have a shorthand when you start working on a feature. Like when you're looking at those feature lists and you're looking at your JIRA and you have personas to lean on or these archetypes, you can say, hey, Pearl or persona, is this going to satisfy her need? Or James's other personality, is this going to satisfy and make James's life better? So we can kind of use that when we talk and kind of decide what is success for this feature that we're going to build. And so I'm going to give you an example of a not so useful persona. I feel like this is kind of like very 90s, where you got like a profile picture and you're like, hey, this person's 45, they're married, no kids, live in some big... His name's Marco. Oh. Oh, okay, well, and so... I did not steal it. I did not copy any person on this. I tried to actually copy this persona from actually ones I saw floating around on the internet. So I do feel like some personas have been made like this, where there are some demographics, some behaviors, and some kind of abstract needs and goals. And so when I kind of look at this, it's not very useful to me. One, because there's a bunch of irrelevant demographics and attributes. This description of Marco as a startup founder doesn't really help us picture how our tool, or how our tool will like fit into Marco's life. And it's kind of like standalone, so you can't really compare Marcos to anyone else, either within your own customer base or to just like other people. And so really, it's not a great tool for decision making. But here's an example of a useful persona. And remember that personas are about communicating a summary of a customer and to, more importantly, support decision making. So a good persona is goal-oriented. I think, especially for a developer profile, that it's an archetype of a role, not of a person. I'm going to show you some attribute sliders that help situate this person or this archetype in a larger context. And in reality, or the result is that we can picture how, if we have a feature come in, we can picture how this feature will solve this person's problem or improve their life. And so here's an example where Marcos is revamped. There's some information about his role. So he's a CTO of a 50 engineering org. And maybe some details here where it's like he has the final say in dev spending budget. So that already says way more than he's 45 and married and has kids. I can actually make decisions based on knowing that he's a CTO of a certain size of organization and some of his responsibilities. And then under needs, goals, and pain points, there's some things that he has on top of his mind where, let's say, a CTO is responsible for an engineering org's efficiency. So he wants to improve that by 3x. Unfortunately, due to the job market, hiring velocity has been affected, so there's a hiring freeze right now, so that's a problem that he's facing. But then he's thinking, hey, maybe I can implement a co-op program to, one, help train the next generation of programmers, but also have a way to work around this budget freeze. And so these are all things that when I kind of think about features that might come in, I can actually use these to kind of measure, is a feature successful? So if my feature can actually speed up development time, Marcos is going to love that. If I can make it really easy to learn, then he's going to love that too, because that means co-ops can come and enter into using your tool quickly. And so, you know, it might seem abstract when you kind of see these bullet points, but when I measure a feature against some of the goals that Marcos has, I can actually see, hey, is this going to be relevant to this person? And then in kind of modern day personas, you kind of look at attributes, and this slider format is really interesting because it gives you a way to contrast and place someone in a wider context. So for Marcos, a startup founder, when we look at hands-on programming, he rarely does this, so he's kind of on the left side of this slider. But he's an expert in data science, so he's up on the right there. And then he's responsible for tech decisions, so he's up in the right there. And so in contrast, let's look at Don, the co-op engineer. So Don is a third-year comp sci student, and he's doing a 6-month placement at Marco's company. So some of the needs that he has is that he's really eager to get hands-on experience developing a real product with real users, but is actually new to data science, so he's gonna have a learning curve. And so when we look at his sliders and compare it to Marco's, it just jumps out to you to like how these different users are, different personas are different, obviously, and the sliders kind of help summarize that really quickly, and they help make decisions because as you work on a product, and I'm kind of hinting at this where a product has multiple users or multiple actors, even multiple buyers, that you kind of need these different personas to decide, hey, is this feature going to be relevant to this person, or is it more relevant to this person? And so I kind of hinted at this. I find that this is something that I've faced as I switched into being product management, is that, going back to this idea that all developers are the same, and that if you're building a developer tool, you only have to think about the developer. But in fact, the user of your tools may not be the person who actually buys your tool. And so I'm going to show an example of something that maybe you're familiar with is like GitHub and how they got some early success with their hosted version control, where a developer might have said, hey, they had a problem, and it was like they needed to store their code somewhere that's not their laptop, and so they were looking for a hosted version control solution. And they found GitHub, and that's where GitHub got a lot of their early users. But then as GitHub started adding more collaboration features, they started charging for that, and so when you wanted to collaborate with another person, you had to kind of upgrade your account. But because a bunch of people really loved using these tools, they went and brought them to their companies and said, hey, budget person, can you buy GitHub for everyone? Because this is the tool that I love. And so with this kind of GitHub example, the adoption was initially driven by individual developer needs, and so that's where they got this tipping point. And I show this example simply because when you're working on a developer tool, almost everyone thinks that this is the cycle that their developer tool is going to go through, and they kind of have this adoption flow in their mind, but based on all the companies I worked at, this has been like not true in the majority of the cases. I'm going to show you an example where, at my time at Ecobee, we had a B2B API. Utility partners, their kind of problem was they had to they had to reduce the load on the grid, and they had to do that by kind of controlling thousands of devices in a home at once in order to reduce the electrical load. And so Ecobee actually had a platform for that where you can control a fleet of thermostats all at once or like within a certain duration. So it was a really cool platform that was geared towards utility partners. So it's very much a B2B API. And so in working with program managers at utility partners, even for them, like they're the ones who made all the decisions and then eventually added in the dev team later. So really they had no idea about what the API, they kind of knew what the API did for them, like what their outcomes were. But in terms of like actual usability, they had no idea until they handed it off to the dev team. So you can kind of see in this scenario, unlike the GitHub example, the adoption was really driven by business needs, and the developers were actually not the primary audience for like why this API was built. A developer is not going to say, I'm going to invent a utility partner, or I'm going to invent a utility company. That's not something that you say as a developer. And then one other thing I've kind of noticed working in the developers platform space is that there are two very distinct types of API platforms or developer platforms. On one side, which I've seen at a few companies, is they already have an API that they use internally. So there's a certain need that happens when you're working on an internal product. You have to make APIs for your coworkers and service-to-service communication. But at some point, they're like, hey, we have a great API, let's make it public. And I've seen this at a few times, so I know this is like not just a couple things. I think it's a bit of a pattern sometimes I see, which is fine. Like actually, I think that's a great idea, but when you think about being in this scenario of you already had an API that was built for internal use, and then you make it public, suddenly you have two different users and goals of your API. Versus where, if you think about a company like Stripe, like a platform like Stripe, that platform was created explicitly as an API, and it had very customer needs attached to it. So it was much more clear like why you would use Stripe or why you would build it. So I just want to highlight that because the experience that I'm going to bring is about this sort of like left-hand side where the dev platform was created to reinforce an original platform, where something like a Stripe was created as a brand new platform. So I'm going to talk about some of my experience at FreshBooks, and I think this is actually really similar to one of the APIs at eQB, but I'm going to use FreshBooks as an example where at FreshBooks, I don't know if I can, oh, can I see? Yeah, okay, so FreshBooks is a cloud accounting software. As I mentioned, they had an API that they exposed. Here I am in the API team. We would build developer tools like documentation. We would get developers to build apps, and then business owners who were FreshBooks customers would then use these apps. So it seems really straightforward, right? But in this scenario, as I started digging into it, I was able to decide that there is a type of developer here, and it's what I would call an owner as developer, where they're temporarily wearing the hat of developer, but in reality, like their day job is to running their business, and so they like to use this API to kind of improve some of their workflows that they were doing as a business owner, but they would only do things like one-off, or they would make very private apps that they would just use for themselves. But at one point, when I joined FreshBooks, they were really interested in making an app store. So this is very different because suddenly we had another persona that came through that I called the developer entrepreneur, who they weren't a business owner in terms of like being a FreshBooks customer, but they were very entrepreneurial to say, how can I make apps that business owners would use so then I can make a career out of building apps. iOS is like this with the iPhone apps or Android apps. And so I kind of called this persona developer entrepreneur. And so already you can kind of see that there's like two very distinct types of users. One is an owner as a developer who's like just building private apps, but then a developer entrepreneur who like needs to get their app onto an app store and get it public. And they're really concerned about making money, where the owner as a developer is more concerned about improving their own individual workflow. And then now to add to that, we realized that not everyone is a developer entrepreneur. There's actually this idea that as a business owner, they have an entire software stack. So not just FreshBooks, but they have HubSpot, they have CRMs, they have other tools that they use, and they want all their tools to talk to each other. And so we actually had a bit of a new demographic in terms of a developer persona that we called SaaS partners, like software as a service partners, where we had to do a completely different way of getting them on board to building our platform. And like managing requests from owners, business owners. It was suddenly here's like this whole third group of people. And sometimes these SaaS partners, they had their own internal team, and sometimes they hired individual contributors or like contractors, like developers, dev shops, dev contractors to come in and actually build some of their tools. And so suddenly you have this other persona where they don't care about being a developer entrepreneur. We found that when I had interviewed and looked at some of these developers, some people were very risk adverse, and so these dev contractors, they just wanted to get paid for this job that they did. They didn't want to support an app long term. Where a developer entrepreneur, they were like, okay, how can I make this reoccurring revenue from this app? I'm willing to take more risk. So even within looking at these so-called developers, they actually had very different motivations, and we had to talk to them in different ways and actually offer different features to them. And so when you kind of think, we had these four, and then we also had internal API users, which I'm not going to include here. But you can kind of see that when we go back and look at the personas, how all these sliders and attributes for them are on different spectrums. They're motivated by different things. And so when we would kind of figure out, like if a feature was coming in or when we were looking at our roadmap, we would try to figure out, like, how are we going to prioritize these conflicting needs from different personas. There is an art to prioritization, which I probably can't get into here, but I will say that the benefit of segmenting out your users into kind of like these distinct buckets is that you can kind of focus on, hey, if I'm going to focus on, let's say, developer entrepreneurs and getting them on board, I'm probably going to want to prioritize all the features that give them enough momentum to have an outcome versus sprinkling a feature for an owner, sprinkling a feature for a SaaS partner, or maybe just improving the docs. And so when you're kind of sprinkling features, you're not getting a lot of momentum. And so by having this user segmentation, you're able to kind of focus and kind of have a prioritize your features for a user in order to get this, to at least see some momentum on your side. So I think that's one of the key things of having segmentation, is to kind of help with that prioritization. So this is a short talk, so I'm not going to get into like exactly all the details around getting into personas, but chapter 4 of the Jobs Be Done playbook is a really great resource, very short. But they reference a book called Inmates Are Running the Asylum. Alan Cooper is probably someone that you've heard of, very influential. This book was written in 2004, and that was probably the first time the word personas kind of popped up for software development. So I haven't read this book, but a lot of people reference this book. But I definitely recommend the Jobs Be Done book as a way to kind of get started. So thank you very much. Hopefully that was useful to you. And I just wanted to thank everyone for being here. And then if you're had a question about the icons, I actually got them from a place called Noun Project, where you can search for an icon and you can find it. And then the doodles are by me on an iPad, so just wanted to clarify that. And if you want to reach out to me, I used to be on Twitter, but you can find me on LinkedIn now. So thank you so much.